program started here while the dessert is being delivered. And our first inductee tonight is Chris Braithwaite from the Chronicle in Barton, Vermont. And to give the introduction here is the news editor of the Chronicle, Tena Starr.
A former Chronicle reporter and now a Boston Globe correspondent put it. In 1974, the Chronicle started out as a scraggly assemblage of smeary pages produced in a corner of Braithwaite's crumbling farmhouse. The newsroom consisted of 2 typewriters, a single telephone, and an odoriferous mutt named Ted Dog. I do remember Ted Dog, and that's all true. By the time I went to work for the Chronicle, that was in 1981, we actually had an office in Barton, but it was kind of a peculiar office. I recall a rooster in the basement, and there was a clothes basket, and one day I started to cry, and I realized there was a baby in it. But by then, the Chronicle, as peculiar as it might be, had become a highly respected newspaper. And it did the kinds of stories that no one else in the Northeast Kingdom where we live was doing. Really hard stories, investigative reporting, long and thoughtful stories that reflected an understanding of and empathy for the place where we live. Vermont's Northeast Kingdom may have a royal-sounding name, but in truth, it's the poor section of a relatively poor state, and people are few and far between. Barton itself has a population of just under 3,000, said Dick Drysdale. He's the publisher of the Herald of Randolph. There are competing daily newspapers in Newport and St. Johnsbury, both less than a half hour away. For Chris to be selling 7,500 copies of the Chronicle every week is nothing less than a miracle. Orleans County residents are very lucky that Chris came along. Chris, before the Chronicle, he worked for the LA Times, for Newsweek, and for several Canadian newspapers, including the Toronto Globe and Mail, and that might be our one problem with Chris, is that he speaks Canadian and we generally speak American. I do recall a day when he looked kind of flustered and he looked at his mostly female staff and said, "Does anybody have a rubber?" Bethany, my co-editor, then looked at me and we looked at each other a little bit alarmed and I thought, where's this going? And we realized that the man wanted a pencil eraser. So we call those erasers in the United States. Howard Mosher, he's a well-known novelist in northern Vermont, and this is what he had to say. Chris Braithwaite is the best reporter and editor I've ever known. Personally, he exemplifies a rare combination of total honesty and extraordinary kindness, along with the highest journalistic ethics and courage. And I have to say that Chris's work has extended far past the Northeast Kingdom. He's worked for the International Center for Journalists and traveling in remote places of the world to help journalists there do a better job. He's worked with newspapers in Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and most recently was in Africa. He's had many accomplishments that mainly, I think, that our heart and our strength as a paper is at home in our little piece of Vermont where we practice community journalism. And so I just want to quote from my own letter recommending Chris because I think this is his greatest accomplishment. We've written about the accomplishments of school children, couples who've lived together happily for 65 years, new and hopeful businesses, bond votes, war veterans returned home, characters of which we definitely have our share, school plays, parades, and we've also written about shady land deals, major and controversial energy projects, murders that tore families and communities apart, child abuse, sex offenders, the disadvantaged, the downtrodden, and the powerful and their abuses. What Chris taught us is that it all matters, big and little. We're a community paper. The people we write about are not nameless, they're not faceless. They're our friends, our neighbors, the people we run into at the grocery store, the people who fix our cars and sell us hardware and pizza. We're not isolated from the community that we report on. We're a part of it, and we damn well better do a good job. Be fair and honest and empathetic, so we can look our neighbors and ourselves in the eye. Courage isn't callousness. Skepticism is not cynicism. Community journalism examines, but it also celebrates. And that's what Chris taught us, and that's what Chris exemplifies. Thank you.
I think my job here tonight is not, in fact, to tell you my life story, but to say thank you. Thank you, Tena. Thank you to, most importantly, all my colleagues at the Chronicle, most of whom conspired behind my back to make this recognition happen. And far more importantly than that, you have, for years and years and years, been the Chronicle, kept the Chronicle going and standing as tall as it can in our community. I need to say thank you to Ellen Braithwaite, who was there helping in that ramshackle farmhouse 40 years ago, and continues to be a very important, critical part of the paper. I need to say thanks to a couple of people who aren't here. Edward Cowan, who couldn't be here tonight, who was the co-founder of Chronicle, a New York Times man, whose idea of having a weekly paper really inspired the founding of the Chronicle. Rudin Young, the late Rudin Young, who was my best friend in Vermont and a dairy farmer and a very, very funny man, who first of all told me, when I told him what I was contemplating doing 40 years ago, he said, "It'll never work." And then a few weeks before the first paper came out, presented me with a column that he'd written for the paper. And the columns that Ludin continued to write weekly, and we put on the back page of the paper week after week. Really, it's hard to overestimate how important they were to getting the paper going. Matt Stewart is here. There was talking in my nomination about a charity we have done for years called Warm the Children, and I asked. It's a great charity. It's helped us put a lot of coats and mittens and hats on a lot of kids in northern Vermont, where it's pretty cold and where there's not a lot of money. Mac invented the program. He started the program. He spread it to scores of newspapers across New England, and we're just one of those papers, and Mac's influence has been enormous. And I'm really glad he's here tonight. We only missed, in 40 years, there was only one press day that the Chronicle didn't come out. And that was because we had a daughter who had the very poor judgment to be born on town meeting day, which is the busiest day of our year. I'm happy to say that she's here tonight with her sister and with 2 grandchildren representing the family. And of course, I need to say thanks to them. And thanks to you all, and thanks to the association.